guest is Ava Pennington. We have to be careful where we get our information about God.
Live your faith and pass it on. Share the gospel clear and strong. Stand for, claim your heritage of truth.
Welcome to Heritage of Truth. Today my guest is Ava Pennington. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Jeanne. I'm glad to be here.
Now, Ava is an author, a speaker, and a teacher, and you have a new book out. Why don't you tell us what your book is?
Daily Reflections on the Names of God. It's a one-year devotional on the names and attributes of God.
And what made you decide to write about that?
I had heard a sermon several years before I wrote this book, and the pastor had he was preaching on the Lord's Prayer. And when he got to "Hallowed be thy name," he stopped and he detoured and he spent the next couple of weeks speaking on the names of God. And he said, if we really want to be able to pray, "Hallowed be thy name," we need to know what God's name is. And that just created in me a hunger to learn more about him, because I thought, you know what? I really don't know all his names, and I don't know as much about who God is as I thought I did.
The names of God have always fascinated me, and I think it should fascinate all believers, because our God is so awesome. He's infinite. You know, it's going to take us forever to understand him, which is so cool. And it's just so neat because we get these clues about his character from the names of God. So why do you think it's important for Christians to take time to learn about God's names and his attributes?
Well, I think it kind of boils down to a matter of trust. It's really hard to trust somebody you don't know.
That's true.
And you said it just a few minutes ago. I mean, God is infinite and we're finite. And so there's already that bit of an obstacle to try and understand who he is. And so if we can really learn what he says about himself, then we're going to have a better foundation for trust.
That's true. Yeah. It's like building that foundation under our faith.
Yes.
Yeah, that's really good.
Yes.
Well, what do you think we can learn about ourselves from God's names?
Well, as Christians, we identify ourselves by who we belong to, don't we? But if we don't really know who we belong to, then that affects our own identity, because then we're not sure who we are. You know, we talk about being Christians, we talk about being bought by Christ, we talk about the Father as our Lord, Adonai, our Master, and yet if we don't really get to know him, then do we understand who we belong to? And if we don't understand who we belong to, then how do we walk this Christian walk?
I think one of the biggest problems today is that people, when they look at, I'm not saying necessarily believers, I'm just saying people in general, when they talk about God and they think they're talking about the God of the Bible, a lot of times it's not the God of the Bible, and their God is far too small. And they wonder, how can you have faith in a God, you know, that is like their thinking, instead of the way God has revealed himself to be. So I agree with you that it's really important to understand who he really is, who he has told us he is. He's revealed that to us.
As opposed to who your parents might have said he is, or some tradition, whether it's a church tradition or a cultural tradition or an ethnic tradition. You know, we have to be careful where we get our information about God. Is it coming from God himself? Is it what he has said about himself? Or is it what people say about him?
Right.
And that makes a huge difference.
Huge. Absolutely. And he has revealed it to us in his word. And, you know, if we just go there.
So why wouldn't we want to spend time in his word and find out what he said about himself?
Yeah. And that's a whole nother subject. God's word, wow, what a rich, rich place to be, to spend our time.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, how has learning about God's name affected your faith relationship with God?
In so many ways. It's actually, I think I could probably boil it down to 3 ways. First, it has impacted my own faith walk with him. You know, I said earlier, it's hard to it's hard to trust somebody you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one thing to know about God, it's another thing to know him as he's revealed himself. I think of how people talk about God, and often Christians will focus on names and attributes of God that they gravitate towards.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we love to think of God as love and mercy, and you know, he's merciful, and he's a God of love, and he's compassionate, and he's forgiving, and we don't want to think about the fact that he's, you know, the judge and the king, and he's holy. On the other hand, there are Christians who focus only on his holiness and his judgment and his righteousness, and what ends up happening is that we create a God of our own making.
Mm-hmm.
We either create this wishy-washy God who tolerates sin because he's all love and he's all sweet and he's all merciful,
Mm-hmm.
or we create this fire and brimstone God who is going to send everybody to hell. And we forget that God is love, but he is also holy.
Mm-hmm.
He's merciful, he's also just. You know, he is the sum of all of his attributes. And if we don't look at the whole package, if you will, and I'm not trying to be flippant, but if we don't look at God as the whole package as he's revealed himself in his word,
Mm-hmm.
then we're really not looking at God, capital G. We're looking at a God, small g, that we've created.
Mm-hmm.
So to answer your question,
Mm-hmm.
it's helped my walk with him,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm seeing, the more I learn about his names and attributes, the more I'm seeing the fullness of his glory. We talk about the glory of God, but do we really know what that means? And really what it means is that God's glory is the sum total of all of his attributes.
Mm-hmm.
All of them together make up his glory.
Mm-hmm.
And you just can't take bits and pieces. So to get to know him better that way creates an intimacy that's amazing. And that leads to the second way it's influenced me. And the second way is that it's changed the way I pray.
Mm-hmm.
Because God isn't just someone up there.
Mm-hmm.
He's just, it's hard to put into words, and I'm a writer, but it makes prayer so much more intimate. Because whatever I'm praying about, whether I'm praising him, I've got the names and attributes to praise him the way he has described himself, or whether I'm thanking him, or if I'm asking him for something, if I'm asking for guidance, I can pray, he's my guide.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm asking for, if I'm confessing sin, well, he's the one who forgives,
Mm-hmm.
So you call on the names and the attributes that apply to whatever you're praying about.
Mm-hmm.
And that prayer becomes so much more specific and so much more intimate,
Yeah.
because you're talking to him about who he is.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last way, or not the last, but one of the ways that it's impacted me is that it helps me share Christ. Because how many times have we tried to talk to somebody about Christ, and they'll say something to the effect of, well, okay, that's your God. Well, my God is whatever, and they'll describe the way they want God to be.
Right.
And knowing God's names and attributes gives me the opportunity to say, well, you know what? That's what you think God is, and maybe you think that I'm just going on my opinion. Let's open the Bible and see what God says about himself.
Mm-hmm.
Here are some of the names he calls himself. Here are some of the attributes that he has emphasized about himself.
Mm-hmm.
So we move from the realm of opinion to what God says about himself. So it's really been helpful to say, let's use that as a starting point.
Good. What is the ultimate message of daily reflections of the names of God?
For me, the ultimate reason that I wrote this was to show people that God has revealed himself. We don't have to focus on our opinions or on what people have told us.
Mm-hmm.
We can go to what he said about himself. Who he is going to impact us three ways. It impacts us in terms of knowing who he is.
Mm-hmm.
It impacts us in terms of knowing who we are in relationship to him.
Mm-hmm.
And then it impacts our relationships. And in fact, that's why the way the book is structured, it's 122 names and attributes. but each name or attribute is looked at 3 different ways. The first way, the first day on that name is this is who God says He is. And the devotional is structured around that. The second day on the same name or attribute is a different devotional, a unique devotional. But the focus of the second day is this is who I am. This is how I am changed because that's who God is.
Yeah.
And then the third day is another unique devotional on that name, that same name. But now the emphasis is, all right, if that's who God is, and that's who I am now as a result, how does that affect my relationships? How does this name or attribute affect the way I relate to people?
Oh, that sounds great.
Yeah.
I can't wait to read it.
Oh, thank you.
So what is your favorite name or attribute of God?
I've been asked that several times, and I know it's going to sound like a cop-out. But my favorite name or attribute changes based on the day, the time, the circumstances. You know, I
think that's the best answer you could give, honestly, because I was thinking I couldn't choose one.
If I'm struggling, let's say I'm struggling with temptation, then the name or attribute of God that's going to really speak to my heart at that moment might be His attribute of holiness, that God takes sin seriously. And so I need to take sin seriously.
Yes.
And that helps me stand against sin. Or if I'm seeking direction and I'm really confused about something, well then I am going to go to God and just appeal to Him as my guide.
Yes.
You know, or if I'm feeling really weak and exhausted, then at that moment the attribute I'm going to latch onto is going to be the fact that He is omnipotent and He has all the strength I need to do what He's called me to do. Someday I'm going to face death, and at that moment I promise you my favorite name is going to be resurrection.
Yeah.
Resurrection and the life, because that will be my greatest need at that moment.
Wow.
So,
Well, Ava, I really appreciate your coming and being our guest.
oh, thank you.
And I hope people will look for your book again.
Daily Reflections on the Names of God.
Right. And how can they find you online?
They can find me through my website, which is www.avawrites.com. That's A, V as in Victor, A, WRITES, avawrites.com.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Share